About, I don't know, I'd say at this point, I don't have the date offhand, but I would say probably about a week and a half to 2 weeks ago, give or take. I had a thought come through that I took action on. And this thought was correlated with a development that's local here in Troy. It's a development project at the address of 2129 and a couple other addresses on Fifth Ave. So 2129 was a building on Fifth Ave that was recently demolished, and this event was explored in the last video, and that sort of evolved into an exploration of the larger development that is proposed for that particular project site. And it's a project site that expands sort of the block on that corner of 5th and Federal Street. And so through that exploration, I experienced this inspired thought come through about reaching out to the neighborhood group that is negotiating with the developer to find some common ground, because the neighborhood group hasn't felt pleased about the development overall and the process by which it has gone about in terms of its incorporation with the structures that had been on that property prior to the development proposal. And so I had this inspired thought was, why don't I reach out to this neighborhood group to become, with the intention of becoming a bit more intimately involved in, or just to, with the intention of becoming a bit more intimately aware of sort of the inner landscape of the relationship between the neighborhood group and the developer. And so in the last video, there's a clip of me writing this letter to Deyva Arthur, who is one of the women prominently involved in this neighborhood group. And at the time of the last video and at the time of that clip, it sort of concluded, if you will, with putting it in her mailbox, her home mailbox, and that was it, with sort of this kind of cliffhanger of what's going to happen. I wasn't really expecting a response, and I wasn't really expecting no response. It just sort of was a feeling I had of, this feels like something I really want to do. And so I would say probably within, I think it actually was that day. If it wasn't that day, then it was the next day, immediately following when I had dropped that letter off, that I did receive an email from Drea acknowledging that she had received this letter. And what's interesting is, in her acknowledgement of receiving my letter, she indicated that that exact day that she had received my letter, she had also received correspondence from the developer about getting together to continue conversations about the development, and that would have been their first sort of get together since the planning board meeting that I also had in a prior video, where the developer appeared to showcase their revised design for the project with the alterations of the 2129 Fifth Ave demolition and the building next to it as well. I found that really interesting, how the developer had reached out the exact same day that I had. And so we exchanged a couple emails back and forth, and ultimately came to a particular day and time where we would meet and sort of discuss a bit further in person the development and sort of its history. That I felt really excited about. I really was looking forward to that at the time, and really appreciated her quickness in response. Fast forward a bit to the day we're going to meet, and I walk over to her location again, and the location of the development, because she's sort of not far from it. And when I got there, she was a bit surprised, only because she had actually thought that we scheduled the meeting for the next day. But at that time, at that moment, she did have a little bit of time to talk with me. So we walked over to the development and just had a really nice conversation about the what sort of has led up to the project and where it's at today. And I learned some really interesting things that I hadn't been consciously aware of prior to that. When we got back to her home, she led me up to her office where she has compiled so many documents into this like almost binder. It's not an actual binder. It's sort of a bunch of it's sort of a thick pile of documents clipped together, sort of representing the history of and the unfoldment of this development and the neighborhood group's involvement in it and their correspondence to the planning, what was the planning commission at the time, from lawyers, from TAP, from other neighbors, and even the New York Preservation Society as well. And she had all this in a folder that she was keeping by her desk, and I just thought that was really impressive. So she ended up giving me these compiled documents that so that I could take a little bit of a closer look at them. And I haven't done so yet, but I am looking forward to reading it a bit more closely. Towards the end of our conversation, as I was leaving her office area, I asked about the correspondence with the developer and if they had come to any sort of decision regarding a follow-up meeting. And she indicated at that time that yes, they had actually determined that there was going to be a meeting at TAP, so at the TAP office, that following Monday. So I believe, if I remember correctly, we met on a Thursday. I don't recall the exact date offhand, but we met on a Thursday, and the meeting with the developer was going to be that following Monday at the TAP office at 2:00. And in our discussion, I asked at that time if it was okay for me to attend the meeting. I really wanted to. I really felt like that was how I was gravitating. It felt like that was the sort of internal invitation. And so in asking, we talked about it a little bit. There was perhaps a bit of hesitancy there, which I understood because it's a bit unusual. I don't live in that particular area of Troy, and I am sort of quote unquote new to the overall development's life. And yet, I believe that I presented myself as well intentioned, transparent, and honest, and genuine in my desire to sort of follow along with this development at any level I possibly can. In talking about it, we sort of agreed that I could come, but it was a bit tentative at the time. And so that was kind of how we left it. I took note of where it was going to be, when it was going to be, and just kind of left it at that. And if anything was going to change, then I was open and accepting of that. The next day, I got an email from Drea that she had actually spoken to another member of the neighborhood group. And in speaking to them, they indicated that they wanted to meet me. So we ended up scheduling a meeting. That was Saturday. No, excuse me. So that was Thursday that we had gotten together, Drea and I, and then we scheduled a meeting with this other person on Sunday. So this was the Sunday before the Monday meeting with the developer. And we ended up having coffee. We ended up meeting at a local sort of bakery, cafe, downtown, and we met for about an hour and a half. And it was a really, really great meeting. It was a really enjoyable conversation. I really enjoyed meeting Ronnie and talking more with Drea just about a host of different developments that are ongoing in Troy, and I felt actually pretty impressed by how much information I was consciously aware of regarding Troy and regarding the different developments that I've been following and sort of researching throughout the last several months. And it just was really, really enjoyable to talk about them beyond sort of myself. So towards the end of that conversation, it just became clear that we were all kind of on the same page in terms of my appearance at the meeting, and the intention going into the meeting was that I would sort of just act as an observer, which was fine with me. That was the intention that I really had predominantly as well, was to simply just witness and observe and be present the in relationship with the neighborhood group and the developer. And so we had the meeting on that Monday, and I didn't really have any expectation going into it. I also didn't really, and I didn't really know what to expect. So, in that, I suppose there wasn't really much expectation at all. It was something that I felt excited about, and really grateful for the opportunity to be present in the meeting and to witness and observe the unfolding relationship. The meeting was probably about an hour and a half, give or take, and it was sort of how would I describe it? It was like there was a lot of conversation about the transformer. So there's a transformer that the developer has to install into the development, because I learned actually that the building is a fully electric building, and that impacted the transformer needed to supply electricity to the development. And so that's why, at least to my understanding so far, that National Grid requested that a bigger transformer be installed in the project than the developer had originally intended. And so there is this big sort of question around where to install it that doesn't feel intrusive and that doesn't feel like a sort of aesthetic eyesore. And so that took up a lot of the conversation, just kind of going through options, going through alternatives. And I don't know that I'd say there was any sort of definitive conclusion or answer that came through the meeting. The other thing that I kind of found really interesting, and I understand that, I understand that schedules conflict and that not everyone who is a member of the neighborhood group is able to participate in the meeting itself. I just found it really interesting how, and this is something that I've touched on before, but it has to do with representation. I don't know, this in a way kind of feels like, now I haven't really dove into any insights or like what I noticed about the meeting. I haven't really sat and contemplated that, except I'm just kind of notating here what I did find interesting, what sort of stood out to me rather immediately, which was the notion around representation of the neighborhood group. And the gentleman who showed up for the developer was one of whom showed up for the developer at the planning board meeting. Colton Hill, I believe, is his name. And I don't recall offhand what his exact title is. I believe, if I remember correctly, it's project manager of some kind. But he was representing the developer, and then Drea and Ronnie were there sort of representing the neighborhood group. And then there was Barb, I think her last name is Nelson. Barb from TAP was also there, and I found it kind of interesting how she almost was acting. Now, I wasn't sure what TAP's capacity was going into this meeting. It might become a little bit more illuminated and clear in reading through the documentation that Drea had provided me from her office, but at that point going into the meeting, I wasn't quite clear on how TAP kind of came into the picture. When I was in the meeting and listening to the conversation, it's sort of Barb sort of presented herself as almost a facilitator, almost like a mediator, but more in a representative capacity of the neighborhood group, and making comments here and there about how the neighborhood group, almost in a way as though she was balancing out the power dynamics, because to some degree it felt at times like the neighborhood group felt like the power dynamics were more in the favor of the developer, and they had to sort of, yes, ask for, but it just kind of, not plead, that sounds a bit dramatic and extreme, but there was a bit of a sense of, is this okay? And rather than, this is what we'd like to see. And I'm not saying that one is right or wrong, good or bad. It's just that that was kind of the position I almost felt like the neighborhood group was kind of coming from, where there was this perception of the developer having the authority, having the power in the relationship. And it was interesting how Barb and perhaps Tap, in a general sense, kind of was playing a bit of a facilitator, but also mediating the power dynamics to reinforce the neighborhood group that they too have authority and power in this relationship. And so that was really interesting. And so there's this aspect about representation just in the sense of the neighborhood group, who, like, the representation of the neighborhood group itself, and they're sort of being, Drea and Ronnie stepping forward, perhaps because of scheduling, perhaps because of aspects and factors that I'm not consciously aware of, but just sort of stepping forth as the representation of the group. And then you also have this aspect of representation of a power dynamic. And so those two sort of aspects of representation really kind of showcase themselves during the meeting. And one other thing I suppose I'd say, about the meeting itself, and this is something that kind of thematically came through in this video during the different events and segments, is that there's kind of this theme around structure. I'm talking about this now, and I'm retelling this sort of story about my interactions and my interactions and my engagement with Drea and Ronnie and the neighborhood group and the developer and even Tap in retrospect, but also because it was largely an event and engagement that was happening in the background of all the other segments that are in this video. And so now I'm sort of retelling it as part of an introduction to this video. And this story that I'm kind of retelling was something that I didn't record during the events of this video, but it was happening in the background. And so I'm sort of retelling it now in retrospect, to add context to the other segments. Because there's a theme that I notice in retrospect that kind of played through in everything that is incorporated into this video. And that theme is kind of this notion about structure and the current perception of structures in our reality, and how they don't always feel like they cultivate a feeling of fulfillment and satisfaction. And I can use the word answers, but it doesn't really feel fulfilling and satisfying and workable to even frame it as answers. Suffice it to say, it just, the legal structures, the institutional structures, the sort of bureaucratic structures, the governmental structures, it's not that they're wrong and bad, and it's not that they're unworkable in a sort of totality, but there are aspects about it that don't quite feel like they facilitate and cultivate something on a deeper level that feels like it is desperate for exploration, desperate for a creative outlet, desperate for some kind of expression. And so there's sort of an exploration into that theme without using these particular words, because it wasn't quite consciously clear to me at the time. And it even comes out towards the end, when there's the enjoyment of the holidays, the enjoyment of Christmas, the enjoyment of Hanukkah, the first night of Hanukkah, and sort of the culmination of what those events really mean and how they were experienced personally. And so that kind of wraps it up almost in like, I don't want to say, oh, what's coming through is sort of a pretty package, but I'm just gonna leave it here for now and just let the video kind of speak for itself, let the theme kind of speak for itself, and then perhaps towards the end, wrap it up a bit more. So I came out today to Mount Ida Preservation Hall, which I've never been to. I've been consciously aware of them for only several weeks, I'd say, but I saw an advertisement for an event that they have today. It's sort of a Explore Troy sort of potluck event where the intention is sort of to share memories of Troy and the hopes for its sort of future. So I thought that sounded really interesting. I baked another pumpkin bread earlier today and it smelled so good. It smells so good. I ran out as soon as I took it out of the oven, so hopefully it doesn't fall apart and it's edible. But so I'm excited. I'm excited to see what this is all about. I'm excited to sort of explore and participate in this organization, if you will. So yeah, it should be interesting, and I look forward to trying, and I look forward to hearing some memories and perhaps expressing some of my own. Just walking up to the space, and I noticed this isn't really a great shot. I don't know if it's coming out well in the video, but it looks absolutely fantastic. It looks so cool. I'll try and get a better shot of it. So you can kind of see it. It's just totally frozen. It's like a frozen waterfall. I'm gonna try and zoom in here, but I'm carrying my bread like a baby. Wow. And then we've got Preservation Hall here. It's such a beautiful building. Got the sounds of the waterfall behind it, the sounds of the creek. Beautiful.
just really thankful to be here at Mount Ida because, yeah, we're hoping to be able to do this project that is an exploration of Troy through sound and visuals, and really wanted to get the stories, and Mandy will talk more about it, but like the stories of people here in terms of like memories, present and future, and collaborate in making this piece, right? We're thinking, oh, it would be so great to have it at Mount Ida because it's such a great community space, and also you support artists and really music as well. So thank you so much for having us in this space.
Of course.
So I guess today, like, we're just going to talk a little bit about the project, and then Michael is going to really introduce where we're at, and we'll hear from you all too, and we'll perform also.
Hey everyone, my name is Michael Easterbrook. I'm the Executive Director for Mount Ida Preservation Association. So this is originally the first Ascension Episcopal Church. It was built in 1869. I'm in the process now of trying to get us on the historic register, so I'm learning about the history of this area, the Mount Ida neighborhood. So I wanted to share some of that history with you guys now. And Mount Ida is this really cool, really fusion of classes, which is like I think the coolest story it has. So we started out in 1817. Troy is all exclusively along the Hudson. It hasn't really developed up the hill yet, and that's because it was expensive to get out here. And so in 1817, there is a mention of the gorge, which is right next to us, as it was in Paris Magazine, and it was basically if you were a rich traveler, one of the things you would come and see on your tour of America would be the Posting Kill Gorge. So they'd get off boats on the Hudson and come basically admire the natural beauty. And so you had a few wealthy folks who owned businesses in Troy, setting up summer homes here because they could afford to have like carriages and things brought out and all the materials set up here. During this time, Troy is beginning to become a hub as we have the locks that bring in materials. So there was iron ore, like in the Adirondacks, that came through Troy and basically made Troy a center for manufacturing of that iron down to like the cities south of Troy. Troy is kind of coming up, and manufacturing is increasing. So from 1830 to 1870, this whole landscape gets totally transformed, and the Posting Kill actually becomes the primary power source in Troy. So there were like 4 or 5 mills all along. And fun fact, they're both true for the Wynantskill and the Posting Kill. Anywhere you see a pond, those ponds were basically man-made gates for water. So there was a lock and a mill, and that pond would have powered a mill when it was needed. So if there was like a shortage, they had that pond as like a impoundment to run the mill and keep it running all the time. And if you go through the gorge and go down there, which you're not supposed to do, but if you do, you can see like the old, they've like blasted holes where like they would bypass water. You can find old grindstones. There's like some really cool old ruins of these mills that existed. That period of time transformed this neighborhood because it was all these mills needed workers, and at the time you built your worker housing right next to the mills where folks would work. And so you had, for the first time, like poor classes, working class starting to fill the neighborhood. And simultaneously, you had transportation. So that transportation hump that made it really hard to get out to this area was being overcome. They set up a trolley system. There was a famous trolley line that took Teddy Roosevelt later on, all the way out to Old Daly, ran right up Pauling Avenue and continued on out. So the combination of that worker housing and these new modes of transportation for getting up the hill and connecting it, you begin to see what it looks like now. That sets up the context for this building and a few of the other big buildings in the area. This building was commissioned by the Farnham family, which was one of these wealthy owners in the area. And it was a way to basically, you know, for better or for worse, it was their way of trying to create culture among what they viewed as like the unscrupulous working class, right? It was like, we're gonna have this church, the building across the street was built as an education center, and a lot of times they would have these buildings erected to basically facilitate community, but also provide interaction opportunities between the wealthy and the working class. So there's these opportunities to begin mixing the classes. And that's the context where this building gets erected. And it was an Episcopal church, stayed that way until 2000, and the Episcopal church was shrinking, and they abandoned the building. Sat neglected for 9 years until the city of Troy was actually going along and demolishing buildings that were looking at neglect and potential safety hazard, and this building was on the list. And very luckily, there was some public outcry about the building. It's like this great example of American Gothic architecture. We have, these are lamp-stained glass windows. So there's this public outcry, and it just so happened, going through the paperwork for demolition, they found a reverter clause in the deed, which allowed the building to pass to a descendant of a reverend of the parish in this building. And it just so happened that there was one such descendant living in the neighborhood. His name is Brant Caird. He is the grandson of a Reverend James Caird that practiced here. And so the building was able to pass to Brant, and he happened to have Mount Ida Preservation Association, a nonprofit focused on historic preservation, which was built around saving the dam here. So there was a dam that impounded what's called Ida Lake or Belden's Pond, one of those historic ponds that powered the mills. Later on became a focus point of recreation for pretty much the subsequent 100 years after the mill closed. People loved to ice skate and kayak, so it was the organization was focused on the dam. So he had this nonprofit that was sitting empty. He was able to pass the church onto the nonprofit, and that's when Mount Ida Preservation Association began the work to save this building. They didn't have any idea what they wanted to do when they started. They got the building, just wanted to save it. A bunch of ideas got tossed around, but we began to find our mission as it stands now in 2016, which is when we got a CO for the downstairs, and our local food pantry had lost its original location and needed a place. So we said, we have the space, let's have the local food pantry run here. And that kind of started us as becoming a community-focused organization, and we realized through the food pantry that one of the best ways that we could support the building is actually, maybe it should have been obvious, that a building that was built to be about community building, once again, comes back to community building. So we focused our mission on turning this building into a community and art center as a way to bring people together and create these channels of support and creativity and outlets for interacting with each other and building that collaborative neighborhood atmosphere. So that's the context that we're in now, that this program is a part of, and we're super excited for Alex to bring a program here and getting us all together to talk about history and what Troy means to us, and what it's looked like in creating this crazy mess, turning it into art. And I think I'll leave it there.
So I want to talk a little bit about this project. I'm a collaborator. First, for those who just came in, hi, I'm Manuel J. Perez III. I go by Manny. Feel free to call me by my nickname. I'm a musician and interdisciplinary artist. I do lots of different stuff. Today, you're going to see me do a little bit of visuals and sound. I've been really lucky to work with Alex, Adam, and Jason of Rock City Falls Trio on this incubator project that we're putting on February 25th at Troy Savings Bank Music Hall, or at a location that's affiliated with Troy Savings Bank Music Hall. And when we got this opportunity, we were thinking about, what kind of project do we want to pursue as a group of 4 people? Being a resident of Troy, I moved to Troy about a year ago, so I'm fairly new to the city. But since coming here, I've just felt like the city is a very special place. You know, something with a place with lots of diversity, both in terms of like socioeconomic class, but also ethnicity, activity, culture. There's so much beautiful essence in the city of Troy. And so every time we would come back to brainstorming our collaboration, I would just think about like, what can I do to like give back to the city that I'm now a part of and trying to be a member of. And the only thing that could come to my mind is try to channel the ethos of the most important or beautiful or agonizing characteristics of Troy and bring that into our art. So really what we were sort of inspired by today, or to bring about today, is the idea of incorporating a kind of collective consciousness about Troy into our improvising. We are all four of us are improvisers, and that's sort of at the core of this project. And to just talk a little bit about improvisation, for me at least, the freer you get to spontaneously create, the more open your possibilities are. And once you open that space up, you can let yourself be influenced by multiple things. And so for me, and I think for our collaborators as well, the essence of this project is trying to capture the collective consciousness of the city and bring it into art, both music and visuals and movements and other forms of expression. We hope that you'll share stories with us, memories of the city, the things that make you smile or that make you frown, you know. This morning, Alex and I were at brunch here at another wonderful offering at the space. It was a really great time, Michael. I actually really enjoyed it. And really what was exciting for me is you didn't see just one kind of person represented. There were so many people from so many different backgrounds together having food and sharing a little bit of their experiences in Troy. You know, I heard things related to like the most underprivileged of us, those who are houseless, who have families. I also heard about folks who are in charge of certain public forum spaces like libraries this morning. So it was really encouraging and really enriching to see all of these connection points between the person who has to, you know, take an hour bus to get to Walmart to pick up groceries, an hour bus back, versus those who have access to more resources, who are in charge of building community in their spaces. And I think that by taking this kind of focus and treating Troy with care, both in how we discuss it, but also how we live in it, that we can really find interesting and fruitful ways to express the city and also to change some realities for those who are less fortunate. So really, to me at least, now I'm just speaking from the heart for this project, I feel like this project really provides an opportunity to bring awareness to certain things about the city of Troy. And we're gonna give you a little 15-minute demo of what we've been working on to sort of set the tone for how we might channel Troy into our art. But ultimately, we're most excited to just hear your stories and hear your thoughts about the city and about your communities that you're involved in. With that, I think we might play a little bit.
All right, so there's some interesting planning board items on the agenda for the meeting tomorrow, which is December 17th. And I wanted to take a look at the agenda today in sort of preparation to become more consciously aware of what is up for discussion tomorrow. And I won't be able to attend the meeting tomorrow in person. I don't know that I'm going to attend online in real time either. I might end up watching it after the fact, but regardless, I wanted to be more consciously aware. And so let me pull up the planning board agenda here. La da da da. Let me microphone. Okay, so I've got the planning board agenda here pulled up for tomorrow's meeting. So there's some interesting items here. I'm not actually going to go into any of them at this point, although I have taken a sort of brief cursory look at this 230 2nd Street, which is a property that's currently sort of a vacant lot. And it's next to a really old schoolhouse building that is fantastic. I love that building. It's so aesthetically pleasing. But it's sitting currently next to a vacant lot. I want to go walk over there and take a look. I don't know when I'm going to do that offhand. Part of the new business, so this first item here is actually the item that I'm the most interested in this current moment recording. But the one below it, this 39 through 45 Congress Street, is another item that is definitely of interest, and I've also taken a quick look at. What's interesting about this particular project that I'll just quickly notate is that it's predominantly sitting on Congress Street, and Congress Street is where there has also been this proposed project of the sort of Congress Ferry Street Bridge development, which spans it spans for a large portion of Congress up through a large portion of Ferry Street. And I can imagine that that project would have some kind of impact on this particular development of Congress Street, because in the proposal, there's no intention of developing off-street parking. It's just sort of identifying what off-street parking there appears to be in this current moment, which is sort of its own, which sort of has a bit of a rabbit hole in it, which I'm not going to currently go into, but I guess all that to say that there are some interesting projects that are in the lineup for the planning board this week, but the one that I want to focus on the most currently is this first listed here under new business, which is 269 to 275 Fifth Avenue. And it's another Fifth Avenue project, but the interesting thing about this particular one is I really quickly pulled it up on my computer, and this location is the exact location where the Beacon Art Peace Project had been located for the last several weeks. So it's on that same vacant lot where the Beacon was, and I just found that absolutely fascinating. I really wanted to look into what this was. And the Beacon was a really big aspect of the last video, and exploring the Beacon and having conversation with the woman who sort of the inspired thought came through, and then meeting her husband sort of in this very serendipitous way, who constructed the design, who constructed the structure, ultimately going to the sort of finale event at the Art Center and celebrating the culmination of what the piece really kind of came to be, if you will, and at least up until that current moment. And so really interesting how as soon as the Beacon is removed from that site, there's this development proposal that's now coming before the planning board meeting to develop that whole sort of corner lot. And the other interesting thing about it is when I was exploring the beacon and talking to Deyva, who is the woman I mentioned who had this sort of inspired thought of the beacon, it really highlighted the aspects of crime that have sort of been prevalent within the area as far as I can consciously sort of understand it, as far as I'm sort of consciously aware of it. And the site that is directly next to the so there's the vacant parking lot where the beacon had been sitting, and then directly next to the vacant parking lot is sort of a vacant grassy area. But if you look really closely at the grassy area, you can kind of see that there was an outline of a building. And there, as far as I'm consciously aware, the building that used to sit there perhaps was a two-story family. And maybe I can find an article or a picture of what used to sit on that property. But as far as I'm consciously aware, there was a crime committed in that household. I believe a murder of a woman. Now, this may be inaccurate. I will check on this. I will check on this. But as far as I can remember, there was a woman who perhaps was pregnant at the time who was murdered in that home. And so murdered in the home, and then the home was set on fire. And so the building ended up not being in existence anymore post that event. At the finale event, showcased in the last video, Deyva spoke a little bit about the memorials that inspired her. And I don't believe it was just this one memorial, but if I had to venture a guess, I would say that this memorial probably was one of them that inspired what sort of came to be the beacon. I just kind of find it interesting that now that the beacon has been removed, and as far as I also understood it in talking to Wayne, Deyva's husband, he had mentioned to me during our conversation that it was the owner of the lot who sort of enabled them to set the beacon up there. I had asked him if they had received a permit from the city because I was just curious how it was that they were able to have the beacon on this property, and especially for so many weeks. And so he had informed me that they had tried to go through the city at one point to obtain a permit, but that never really came to fruition. They didn't really get much feedback from the city. And so rather than going through the city, they just ended up going directly to the landowner. And he didn't tell me at the time who the landowner was, and I didn't ask, but he did say that in going straight to the landlord or the landowner, that the landowner was the one who said, sure, go ahead and set up the structure. And so it's just kind of interesting that now that the structure has been removed, that there's this application in front of the planning board for that particular property. And not only that property where the beacon sat, but the one directly next to it, which is also vacant land, where there once was this building that was burned to the ground after a murder was committed. Okay, so we're a bit zoomed in here. So the name is Brunner LLC. Contact Khalid Akhtar. Yeah, so 269, 271, 273 Fifth Ave. So let me pull that up on maps here. Okay. So here's Fifth Ave. Fifth Ave is stretching all the way up here, but here's the property. Zooming in, so this vacant spot here. Okay, so this map is relatively old. It's interesting actually because it's still showing a building structure here. But we have Vanessa and Alina's memorial, which when we go to the picture here, so this is sort of what I'm referring to in terms of you can kind of see the remnants of what used to be a building sort of foundation here, or just the base of it. But this building over here, just to confirm, is 265 Fifth Ave. And what we're talking about on the application is 269, 71, and 73. So this is 265, so assumedly that would mean 269, 71, and 73 would stretch to the corner here. And this vacant lot is where the beacon was. So the proposal here, project title, Checkerboard Plaza. Ground up construction with 4 retail units and 9 apartments with 1 to 2 bedrooms. First level laundromat. Second floor apartment. So first level is all commercial, and then the second level is all residential. I suppose keeping a portion of that parking lot, if not the whole thing. I just love how Google Maps depicts different aspects of the same area depending on when a picture was taken. It's just really interesting. Here we have this construction looking site. Oh, interesting. Okay, well, here we have June of 2022. Okay, so it looks like there was an interesting structure here. Almost looks like a barn. Wow. That's interesting. That's really interesting. I wonder how old this was. Wow. Yeah, so this would have been where the memorial was. That's really interesting. Let's see if I can go back to that picture with it demolished. Yeah, wow. Okay, so this was as of April 2023. I wonder what that was. Yeah, I don't think that's too bad. I wish I could see the front of it. Oh well. Well, if it's meant to be, I'll find out. Okay, so that's interesting. Wow. So there's a 1-bedroom apartment on the first floor next to a laundromat, and the rest of the ground level being retail. That's interesting. But it's showing as a laundromat. That's a little confusing. As far as I can read the plans, they're saying there would be a 1-bedroom at the front on the first floor. Unless I'm reading this inaccurately. Building 1, first floor plan. 1-bedroom. 9 apartments. Okay, so this is 1 unit. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Yeah, 9 is on the first floor. It's just kind of interesting to have the apartment on the first floor and above their window have it just say laundromat. It's just interesting when things are left blank. Will the proposed action result in a substantial increase in traffic above present levels? Are public transportation services available at or near the site of the proposed action? Are any pedestrian accommodations or bicycle routes available on or near the site of the proposed action? It's all left blank, number 8. Interesting. So for 12A, there's like this addendum. Question 12A, it says yes. So does the project site contain, or is it substantially contiguous to, a building, archaeological site, or district which is listed on the National or State Register of Historic Places, or that has been determined by the Commissioner of the New York State Office of Parks, Recreation, and Historic Preservation to be eligible for listing on the State Register of Historic Places? And they answered yes. I'm not quite sure what they're referring to, unless it's this home. Interesting. Question 12B, yes to. Is the project site or any portion of it located in or adjacent to an area designated as sensitive for archaeological sites on the New York State Historic Preservation Office Archaeological Site Inventory? Huh. I wonder if that has to do with the building that was seen on Google Maps that has now been demolished. That looks like a very old building. And I wonder if there's still a state, well, I guess, how would it have been demolished? I don't know. I don't know what this is in reference to. Threatened or endangered animal, bald eagle. Remediation site, question 20. Has the site of the proposed action or an adjoining property been the subject of remediation for hazardous waste? Yes. Interesting. Existing off-street parking, number of off-street parking spaces required, 0. Oh my gosh, Otis. What a silly boy. Oh. Yeah, so it looks like they have here 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 sort of standard parking spots, and then with 1 wheelchair accessible makes it 10. I don't know if they intend those spots to be for residential use or retail. Oh my gosh. Whoa! I guess they're just anticipating that people will use existing off-street parking. I'm not sure there's anything specifically coming through. I just found it to be really interesting. I'm very curious to hear the conversation at the planning board. I honestly also kind of have a thought. There's this curiosity that keeps spinning in my mind around, do I reach out to Deyva? I don't even know that I'd say it's a curiosity. It's like a little bit of a desire. Perhaps that awareness would facilitate conversation, further dialogue, further expression, specifically coming through those who not only are intimately familiar with the area, but who reside in the area. Maybe there's something about having that intimate connection to the land and the particular location of this proposed development, having the openness and communication continuing to sort of flow in terms of that particular spot, which does seem to have an aspect of sensitivity to it. And so perhaps I will reach out to her. It's a thought that came through, and the desire here, especially following the full moon in Gemini yesterday, not only the full moon in Gemini, but trining the Mercury stationing direct in Sag, amongst other infinite aspects, but that really sort of standing out as having this notion of not thinking about it so much and just going for that which speaks directly, if you will. And I know that there's not really that much, I don't want to say that there's not much direct expression here, because I don't want to diminish the process. It feels like something valuable. It feels like there's value there in the potential reality of reaching out to Deyva specifically. It would be interesting to have that further communication and further expression from that more intimate setting, that more intimate space come forward, if it desires to come forward in terms of in connection and in correlation with this particular proposed development. So I am recording. I know I'm recording. So the city council meeting last night was a meeting that at first there wasn't really much interest in because I just had it listed in my phone as a finance meeting. And so I didn't actually end up looking at the agenda for the meeting until very soon before the meeting was supposed to occur. And so because of that, I didn't end up having the time to really look through the agenda materials. And when I finally ended up looking at the agenda prior to the meeting, I did notice that there were 2 resolutions that actually did speak to me. They had to do with a specific site in the Little Italy neighborhood, sort of known as the Little Italy Marketplace. And it's a site that currently sits vacant as a vacant parking lot. And there have been proposals for a development on this site before that I have followed and participated in, but at least up until this point, nothing has really physically come to fruition. And so it's something that I have been very interested in for some time. So when I saw that there was something on the city council agenda about the marketplace, that sort of immediately sparked my interest. And yet, because it was so close in time to the actual start of the meeting last night, I didn't have the time to go through the agenda materials. So I did end up attending the meeting, and what I found kind of interesting was that when it came to this particular resolution, there was very little conversation, there was very little dialogue around this particular resolution by the city council.
So taking my deputy mayor hat off, I am still a proud member of the Quality of Life Committee in Little Italy that has worked tremendously hard on this project and getting it to where it is. Our co-facilitators, Sam Chapone and Heather Hamlin-Martin, are unable to be here tonight to show the support. So they did ask me to read a letter to the council. So, dear council members, as co-facilitators of the QLC in Little Italy, we would like to take this opportunity to express our strong support for the market resolutions, which involves securing necessary funding and government agency approvals to move this project forward. Due to prior commitment, we are unable to personally deliver this message. However, we have asked Seamus Donnelly, a long QLC member, to represent us and deliver this message on our behalf. This market project has a long history of discussions, ideas, and plans to transform this limited use open space into a vibrant community gathering space for both the Little Italy neighborhood and all city residents. It is a project that holds great promise for enriching the cultural, social, and business fabric of our community. Our Quality of Life Committee is honored to serve as stewards of the history of this space for a period spanning decades. A dedicated, enthusiastic group of community members has worked to keep the market as a gathering place for the community. We have decorated for the holidays, improved the space with picnic tables, maintained the bocce courts, and coordinated events such as neighborhood garage sales, festivals, farmers markets, movie nights, and many other events. We remain committed to learning from that history, engaging with current neighborhood input, and collaborating with our elected officials to create an improved vision for the gathering space. We are excited to see this vision become a reality, and this resolution is a critical step toward the success of the project. This is truly a transformational project for our neighborhood. Our entire QLC and the Little Italy community will continue to work through the process and eagerly look forward to the completion of this project, which will benefit not only our neighborhood, but the entire city. We would be remiss if we attempted to name all those past and present who have supported this project. You know, as we do, who you are. However, we must take a moment to acknowledge and thank our current and past elected officials and city administrators for their steadfast support and attention to our requests. We would also like to recognize TAP Inc. and Labella Associates for their engineering and design guidance in supporting this project. We look forward to continuing our involvements in the planning and discussion surrounding the outcome of this project. We sincerely hope the council will offer its support for this resolution. Thank you for your time and consideration. Sincerely, the members of the Little Italy Quality of Life Committee. Two people that I would feel remiss not adding here is my friends, God rest their souls, Michael Esposito and Marion Fields, who truly many years ago started, making sure that the rest of the city realized the character of the Little Italy neighborhood, and it's fascinating to see how quite far it's come. So, thank you.
Anyone wish to comment? Discuss? Okay, all in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Did you want to comment?
I was
You
just
had your mouth open
Easy,
as
Rick.
I was calling the vote.
Normally, the city would be the grant recipient. In this case, for reasons that have never been sufficiently explained to me, TAP is the grant recipient, and therefore we need the sub-recipient agreement, which you have just passed, to access the grant. And TAP is going to take a modest administration fee, and for which they've already done some work and will be doing some more. So you're not being asked to declare whether to make a negative or positive declaration
Right.
today.
Right.
And some work has already been done by Labella. We were going to provide the council with that before the next meeting.
Okay,
And,
perfect, that's all I was
is
asking.
that all?
Thank you.
Any other questions, comments? All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Resolution 161 is adopted unanimously.
It sort of left this feeling within myself of dissatisfaction and a bit of unfulfillment. And so I noticed that as I was sitting there, I was feeling surprised. I noticed myself feeling surprised by the quickness that it not really even it was the quickness, but it was the sort of lack of commentary. It was just a sort of lack of any kind of discussion around the resolution. I couldn't really say at the time because I hadn't reviewed the materials and I wasn't really consciously aware of the context to any extent that sort of allowed for questions or perspectives or commentary to really come through. It almost felt like I was sitting in this like weird void of information. And it just kind of felt like the sort of lack of information expressed during the meeting about this particular resolution enhanced that. It just sort of exacerbated the feeling of a lack of information that I had going into it. It didn't really feel like it clarified anything, and I don't know that I'd say I necessarily went into the meeting expecting clarification, but I just found it interesting how I noticed myself feeling disappointed and feeling, like I said, sort of dissatisfied and unfulfilled by the time the resolution was passed. In sort of saying all of that, I feel a gravitation now. I feel a gravitation currently to go back into the agenda materials to actually explore what was provided as to provide context to the sort of overall resolution on this particular agenda item. And it has to do, okay, so now that I've said all that, a really long-winded, coming sort of full circle to actually say what the resolution is about, more than just the site, it has something to do with, I think it allows the mayor to enter into an agreement that authorizes the city to act as sub-recipient of grant funding, so that the city basically takes on the responsibilities of procuring this development. And I found that really kind of odd a little bit. So I wanted to get into the materials. I'm not quite sure what we're going to find. I'm not really sure what's going to come through, but I do feel an openness and a curiosity, and we're gonna do it. So let's do it. Let's do it. Okay. So scrolling past ordinances, resolutions. 160, resolution authorizing the mayor to enter into a sub-recipient agreement with TAP, Inc. to allow the city to receive a HUD community project funding grant for construction of a community piazza at the historic Little Italy marketplace. And then 61 being resolution declaring the Troy City Council lead agency for review under the state SECRA of a project to redevelop the Little Italy marketplace. Okay, so here's resolution 160. Yeah, okay, so whereas the city of Troy owns the fenced and vacant asphalt paved lot on Hill Street in the Little Italy neighborhood, as well as the small picnic area and bocce ball court to the south. Now, I have pictures of this that I've taken before, so perhaps I'll insert them here at some point in this conversation, in this exploration here. whereas the location formerly was used as a farmer's market in the 19th and early 20th centuries, and thereafter several produce and wholesalers established their warehouses across from the marketplace on the west side of Hill Street. The other interesting thing about this particular site is prior to it being used as a farmer's market, it actually was the site, and I feel like I've mentioned this in a prior video, but it was the site of the gas. Now, I'm not recalling exactly the company's name nor the technical process, but it was the site where the oil and gas company had their sort of their processing site to change, I think it's coal, although that might be inaccurate, into usable gas for the lighting of the streets. And I think the gas somehow used to be funneled from that site to the gas holder building that I think I've also definitely mentioned in a previous video, because the owner, I believe, of that gas company, that gas and lighting company, was someone who lived in the home that I've explored in a prior video, 1819 Fifth Avenue, which is across the street from 1818 Fifth Ave, where there is a proposed developmental site that I've explored before. So there's a little bit of a connection there, but this site on Liberty Street here, this Little Italy marketplace, prior to being the farmer's market, was the site of this like industrial gas processing company. And I actually feel like I remember reading at some point that this particular site, I don't know if it was a super fun site, but there were some kind of environmental issues that I believe may actually still exist. I don't know offhand consciously if it still exists as an issue, but I feel like I remember reading that there was some kind of environmental potential contamination there because of the prior use. So TAP previously submitted for year, I'm assuming FY, submitted an FY 2023 community project funding request through the office of Congressman Paul Tonko for a U.S. HUD grant to develop the Little Italy Marketplace into an outdoor community gathering place. So TAP submitted a funding request to Congressman Tonko for a HUD grant and was awarded $500,000, with the project designated as Troy's Little Italy Historic Market Park Project. Mouthful. The project will redevelop the marketplace by expanding the active public use area for the use of the neighborhood and the entire city. The project is a city project to be constructed on city land for the public good and benefit of the residents of Troy. TAP has entered into this grant agreement with HUD, which sets forth the terms and conditions of the grant, governs the use and distribution of the federal funds, and requires certain reporting, certifications, and other compliances. Okay, both TAP and the city intend that the city will perform the project and assume the rights and obligations of the grant agreement as sub-recipient, including assuming responsibility for completion of required reporting, certifications, and other compliances as necessary and appropriate. I mean, it largely to me kind of just seems like, now I'm not familiar with grant funding. It largely seems to me like the predominant responsibilities of a grant recipient is the allocation of the funds, compliance with reporting. To facilitate the city's receipt of the grant funds for the project, a subrecipient agreement must be established between TAP and the city, whereby the city effectively will stand in the shoes of TAP to perform the project and receive the federal grant funds. TAP will be entitled to take an administrative fee of $40,000 from the grant for its services in obtaining and administering the grant. I don't understand at this point why the city is acting as subrecipient at all, and why TAP is not acting as the sole recipient and not taking an administrative fee. It's interesting how if TAP were the only recipient, would there still be room? Would there still be available funds for an administrative fee, as an administrative fee? Yeah, see, this is what, okay, so the mayor is hereby authorized to enter into the subrecipient agreement with TAP on behalf of the city to assume the rights and obligations of the HUD grant agreement and to perform the Little Italy Historic Market Park project and receive the amount of $500,000 for reimbursement of qualified expenditures. Interesting. The mayor shall not enter into a subrecipient agreement with TAP unless and until appropriate environmental quality reviews have been completed for the project. I don't recall if TAP is a nonprofit. With the support of the city, the Little Italy Quality of Life Committee partnered with TAP to complete a design proposal, and TAP applied through Congressman Tonko's office for grant funding to develop the former marketplace into a community recreational space. Other items like landscaping, paving, sidewalks, and a retaining wall will also be completed as part of the project, but these improvements will be funded through the city. Congressman Tonko was able to direct $500,000 towards this project. The city also received $365,000 from New York State. The city intends to fund other parts of this project through the Consolidated Local Street and Highway Improvement Program. Yeah, not for profit. The project will redevelop the public space by expanding the active public use area and constructing new bocce ball courts, pickleball courts, a children's play space, water feature donor wall, seating area, shade shelters, picnic and game tables, a dog run, landscaping, fencing, new paving and lighting, retaining walls, and other site improvements. TAP desires to administer the grant and facilitate the project by transferring to the city, insofar as legally permissible, its obligations and rights under the grant agreement so that the city will perform the project as required and complete such reporting, certifications, etc., etc. The city desires to perform the project and is willing, insofar as legally permissible, to assume the rights and obligations out of the grantee as subrecipient. Interesting. Since the early planning stages of the project, the parties understood and intended that this $500,000 grant would be passed through TAP to the city and be used to reimburse the city as subrecipient of the grant for qualified expenses of the project. I've never heard of a grant subrecipient agreement. And I just find it really interesting how it's the city acting as a subrecipient, and the city taking on the full responsibility and obligations to complete this project. And that the non-for-profit that originally received the grant as grantee takes an administrative fee. Yeah, it's just interesting. So The city hereby releases TAP and HUD from all liability with respect to and agrees to defend, indemnify, and hold harmless TAP and HUD, their respective officers, etc., from and against any and all claims, demands, damages, costs, orders, liabilities, penalties, and expenses related in any way to any violation of the covenants in this section or to any inaccuracy of the representations contained in this section. So in this particular section, they're talking specifically about the environmental implications of performing this agreement, and that no pollutants are going to be stored, treated, generated, disposed of, or allowed at the project site, and that they'll take all necessary steps to prevent a release of hazardous substances or materials into and onto any other property, etc., etc. But it's interesting, as I was kind of commenting before, this site has had some environmental issues, at least to my conscious recollection, in the past. Because of its history prior to being a farmer's market, being the site of oil and potentially gas production and processing, perhaps very crudely. And that having seeped into the soil, I feel like I remember that that site was considered contaminated to some level. Now, that might be inaccurate currently, but it's just interesting how, if there is any accuracy to that, that performing any of this contract, maybe unintentionally, could bring to the surface soil contaminants. The city is solely responsible for all project costs in excess of the grant and has sufficient funding and resources to pay for those costs. I suppose because it's city-owned property, I'm curious if this grant, this grant of $500,000, could it only have been supplied to a nonprofit? Is that why it had to go through TAP? I'm not quite understanding why it had to go through TAP. Almost as though, I guess, I know this word was used before, but I guess it is kind of like TAP acting as the facilitator of these funds for a city project on city property. Have until 2031. A subaward may be made to a for-profit entity only if HUD expressly approves that subaward, and the for-profit entity is made subject to the same federal requirements that apply to other subrecipients. Is the city considered a for-profit? Yeah, if the grantee is a unit of general local government, which seems to me like it doesn't have to be a not-for-profit, so I'm still not quite sure why TAP acted as the facilitator here. If the grantee is a housing authority, redevelopment agency, academic institution, hospital, or other nonprofit organization, the grantee shall request the unit of general local government, Indian tribe or Alaskan Native village, within which the project is located and which exercises land use responsibility, to act as responsible entity and assume all of the responsibilities for environmental review and decision making and action. And the grantee shall carry out all of the responsibilities of a grantee. Oh, wow. TAP has been working with the Little Italy Quality of Life Committee since 2003 to develop a vision for the reuse of the historic marketplace on Hill Street. Troy pursued and has been awarded a $375,000 grant from New York State through Assemblyman John McDonald's office to contribute to this project. With that funding, they will engage a firm to perform the necessary site engineering, environmental evaluation, and landscape architecture services and construction documents. The balance of their funding is for construction. The city is also simultaneously managing 2 infrastructure projects adjacent to the site. Streets are being paved, sidewalks replaced, and a traffic signal installed at the northwest corner of Market Park. Yeah, this site was historically a farmer's market, but in the early 1900s it was used by a local utility to generate natural gas from burning coal. It was owned by Niagara Mohawk for several years as a storage site and underwent a brownfield cleanup in 1993. It was capped in asphalt with the understanding that no digging was allowed on the site. Yeah. Environmental engineers will review the cleanup records and assess its current condition and restrictions. It is presumed that the market park will be a completely hard-surfaced park, much like an Italian piazza. Despite its status as a capped brownfield site, experts and officials are confident that the site can be utilized within legal restrictions. I mean, I guess if I'm understanding it correctly, it does kind of seem like the local government has to have some kind of participation in this grant process. There's still something that just seems kind of, well, I don't know. I guess the question is kind of like, what would I have liked to have seen last night that I wasn't seeing? I mean, I could easily say more discussion, but on what? About what? What is it that isn't really, is there anything that's not really sitting well? Not really. I mean, kind of in reading this, it almost feels a lot more like the site is actually going to be developed. I think for a while, even though I've participated in certain events, in certain public events that have spoken toward the potential design of this project, it still kind of had this feeling of something that was up in the air and not really solidified, if you will, not really grounded. And I suppose to some degree it actually kind of feels a bit more grounded now, although I do wonder where in the process it sort of is in terms of the planning board, public comment, in terms of design. It's unclear to me sort of where it is in its development process. But other than that, I guess to some degree it's kind of exciting to have a potential development of that space. And yet there's a part of me that's also like adverse to it changing, even though it's literally just a parking lot. I think there's so much of me that appreciates open space, even though the open space is a parking lot. It's the same thing with the Monument Square empty lot that's sitting on River Street. And I've heard so many comments about it being an eyesore, and yet to me, in sort of a personal sense, I really appreciate the openness that that space sort of provides in experience, in the experience of it, of that space, just of that overall setting. So yeah, there's part of me that really appreciate, and it doesn't seem to me like this space is going to be overbuilt. At least that doesn't seem like the intention going into it. I don't even, it's actually a little bit unclear. I remember in one of the public presentations there was a design proposed of a building going on that site. From, excuse me, what I just read, I don't remember actually reading anything about structures being developed. It may just remain an open space, but with some amenities sort of incorporated into it a bit more. Even if there was a structure, it doesn't seem like it's a structure that's really imposing on the setting. So that feels nice. Yeah, I guess in a way I'm interested to see what kind of creative designs come out of this, or just what creative designs are expressed through this idea, and kind of how it plays out, because there are aspects within the area that are there are other developments within the area. There's the 212 4th Street development on that corner property where the tree was, that was then donated to the city as the season's Christmas tree. There is that CDTA bus hub spot that's already finished, and that's already finished. So I don't know. I don't know what else to say about it. I mean, it's just, I appreciate the information. I appreciate exploration into the information, into the materials of this agenda. I guess what I've liked to have seen a little bit more conversation. Maybe it's perfect the way it is. Maybe it's just fine. The amount of conversation that happened is okay. And if anything, maybe it just inspired me in some fashion to actually go back and explore the materials and gain a little bit more perspective on the context of it. Because otherwise, if I hadn't felt anything about it, it's very possible that I would have just moved past it and not read any of the materials, and that would have been okay. But just listening to myself and what was really speaking, which at the time of the meeting and thereafter, immediately thereafter the meeting, was a sense of disappointment and dissatisfaction. And I suppose at this point, I don't know that I'd say I feel satisfied per se, and I don't know that I'd say I feel fulfilled. But I suppose I do feel a bit more breadth of awareness. I suppose maybe a pinch of satisfaction and fulfillment, and perhaps that's simply in the process, that's in the experience of listening to the inner gravitation here, and has nothing to do with the project. It has nothing to do with the project, per se. I do still feel like there's something there, though. I do still feel like there's something that feels missing, so to speak. That feels like something's not quite right. Like something's not quite there. But I can't consciously pinpoint what that is. So I suppose I'll just leave it at that for now and put a pin in it and move on. Let it go and move on.
Christmas Day. Heidi. Ooh, look at her. Was that a good breakfast for you, Tommy? Yeah? Whoa. Yeah, I know. Thank you. What else do you have to say for yourself? Did you have any dreams? Yeah? What kind of dreams? What kind of dreams? Do you want to tell me? You want to tell me about your dreams? Because I want to hear them.
Oh my gosh. Oh my gosh.
Ooh. Ooh.
I don't know. I don't know that I'm gonna eat. I mean, I guess maybe if anything, I could potentially have the rest of that pumpkin bread. Maybe a couple grapes or something with it. And I guess if anything, I'd probably want to eat that sooner rather than later. I'm gonna have to leave in probably give or take about an hour-ish. So I don't want to like pound it and run. I guess I can set it up and eat maybe slowly while I'm sort of talking as they do. That's the thing. I always find it kind of interesting. I'm the kind of person who like just wants to eat. I don't want to be talking while I'm eating because I just want to eat. And there'll be times they'll like put down their food. They'll have a thought, but they'll wait to chew. And I guess in some respects, it actually kind of helps slow down the thought processing. So I don't know, maybe it could help me to process my thoughts a different way. So I don't know, maybe it could be interesting. We'll see. But it's a bit of a challenge to talk and eat at the same time, especially when I feel like there's always like when I feel like the thoughts that I have go a million miles an hour and the verbal expression is sometimes too slow to keep up. And then we'll get into it because I do feel like this whole morning, really since I sort of began waking up, there's been this felt desire to really kind of dive a little bit more deeply and explore what a possible vision here would look like in terms of verbal articulation. And the best comparison, if I had to sort of compare, although I tend to prefer a bit of a conceptual analysis that's like juxtaposition as opposed to comparison. But I suppose juxtaposition is almost just like, I'm just kind of getting this sense of like sitting side by side, juxtaposing the two. There is sort of this subliminal, assumptive comparison that is inherent almost in the concept of juxtaposition, but juxtaposition on its face could simply just be sort of sitting side by side. Whereas comparison is kind of that next step, if you will, of taking that a bit further to focus on what not necessarily the differences. It's just like a different. It almost is a process of differentiation, almost a process of. I'm trying to almost describe comparison without using the word comparison, compare. Um, I don't necessarily want to use juxtapose either because I do kind of feel like it is an expansion of the juxtaposition, which I guess makes sense. I don't know exactly where juxta comes from in terms of a suffix. I think that's the word. That might be inaccurate, but prefix, maybe prefix. Um, but position sort of implying that sitting next to each other, like the positioning being sort of side by side, and then taking that extra step of compare is to sort of almost interpose, like if you were to take it from side by side and actually put one on top of the other, to actually look at the different, to be able to more clearly see the sort of differentiation, not differentiation to label that differentiation as bad and to label that differentiation as wrong, but just to more clearly sort of define those aspects that sort of jump out as alternate. All right, so I'll sit for, I want to leave in like an hour. So if I can start getting myself together by, I don't know, maybe in like 45 minutes-ish. So by 9:20 even. Yeah, so what I keep gravitating toward in terms of juxtaposition slash, I'm just going to say comparison, I might use those words and concepts sort of interchangeably. Just to preface this by saying that the intention in comparing and the intention in juxtaposing is not to label one or another example, if you will, as good, bad, right, wrong. It's just to simply acknowledge where there is a bit of diversity and where there is a bit of, I guess, sameness, similarity. But the example that I keep coming back to, also while I'm practicing this sort of eating while contemplating, is being present and mindful about the sensations of the palate. So the sensations of eating and being present with that process and being present with that experience with the intention that that sort of stillness in the mind and focus on sensations in the physical body allow for the room to receive an expression that perhaps is a bit more direct and accurate. It also, I have the virtual fireplace going on YouTube in front of me as well, so that sort of assists and facilitates in the visual focus as well as the sort of bodily sensations. This is facilitating more of an auditory focus and visual focus, which I suppose could be facilitated by focusing on the visuals of the food. But I like the ambiance of the fireplace and the sounds. So yeah, the example that keeps coming through very strongly and clearly is the example of, I don't know if I'd necessarily call it like a project. I perhaps would frame it as an inspired vision, an inspired idea, perhaps, that sort of is manifesting through Richard Flyer. So, Richard Flyer is a gentleman who I've been following on Substack for several months, and he has been posting on a regular basis. I don't recall exactly what the cadence is. It might be once a week, thereabouts, but he, on a sort of regular cadence, has been posting chapters of a book that he is soon to publish. And it's a book largely expressing the experience that he has had in connection with sort of divine inspiration, divine embodiment, and how that connection and embodiment has led to the relationships that he has cultivated throughout his life, and specifically in regard to sort of connections in facilitating. I don't recall the exact terminology that he uses, but facilitating and sort of cultivating a symbiotic network within a community, and the community is within a sort of township community, a city community. And he often will, and he goes into principles that sort of found the symbiotic network, this sort of symbiotic culture that is being cultivated and facilitated. He largely goes into the principles and values that found a culture of that nature, and how he's sort of arrived, if you will, at those principles and values. And so I haven't read every chapter. Quite honestly, I'd love to spend some time really diving a bit deeper and more with more focus on the narratives, not only to sort of refresh my memory, but to also just sort of sit with an expression that already exists as verbal articulation that to a large degree is very correlated with sort of a vision that I have had as well. And yet the vision that I have had is not really, at least I kind of feel like it hasn't yet sort of coagulated, if you will, into a verbal articulation that can be reproduced, that can be, I don't necessarily, so standard is the word that just came through. The intention here is actually, I'm thinking about this now, because this is the first time this formulation of the vision, if you will, I've always just called it the vision. And it's been very vague. And it's become more clear as I've gone day by day. That's how it sort of has organically evolved. And I don't intend to pressure it, I don't intend to force it. And so the sort of, for lack of a better phrase, lack of an articulable an articulable expression of it doesn't devalue it, doesn't make it unworthy. If anything, I tend to feel more excited at times about it because it's continuously informing me of it rather than sort of the other way around. And so it's interesting how I just kind of used or heard sort of the word standard as I was kind of flowing in that articulation, because that's not something that I've ever thought in the context of this. And so to say it out loud is having me kind of rethink now, or just reflect on it and ask myself, how does that feel? Because it feels a little strange. It feels kind of like, oh, I don't know if that really fits here. Maybe perhaps I'm gaining in this real-time moment a different perspective on sort of the quote lack of an articulable expression, because it's not supposed to be standardized, if you will. It's not supposed to be a sort of elevator pitch that I memorize and can just wing out at any given moment upon request. It's something that I sit with and feel into and allow to express in and of itself what is being embodied in that moment, what is being visualized, what is being sensed in that moment, because it's a part of it. It's not encompassing the totality, if you will, the holistic picture, and it wouldn't, no matter what articulation of it is expressed. And so perhaps the inherent mutability is expressed as, this is what articulates now, come back in 5 minutes and it'll be something different. And so it's sort of this invitation to continuously circle back and continuously be open to receiving that expression in its infinite forms, and to sort of as best as possible. And this is part of why it's interesting how it's not just meant for one person, even like one person to even express. It's for everyone. It's developed for and by everyone, and that continual process of information is what breathes life into it. So it's even more than just a vision. It's a lived experience simultaneously with being sort of an abstract conceptual possibility. And being present in peace with that, because there does tend to be a feeling, an experience within the body of impatience, of a feeling of being out of control without that sort of standardization. And I'm not even necessarily saying that standardization is null and void. I'm not necessarily saying that standardization is not of value, not worthy, and that it doesn't have room here. That's not what I'm saying either. Perhaps it's just that there's an invitation to explore where standardization actually feels aligned. And perhaps this is just not where it feels aligned currently. But I guess to sort of circle back to the juxtaposition, the sort of comparison of the sort of work that Richard Flyer is doing, I sense and I see a lot of similarity. And so a lot of what he sort of speaks to is this kind of development of a network grounded in nodes. And by nodes, it's these groups of, I again don't really recall consciously the exact terminology that he uses, but it's some kind of culmination of certain leadership within the community that have already developed sort of networks of their own. They're sort of considered almost the contact points, the intersections, the just the points of traffic, the points of communal traffic that have a stretch to them, that have a certain bandwidth within their network that can disperse information, that can disperse resources, that have resources. And when those leaders come together and form these sort of nodes, there are these formations that facilitate greater communication, that have the potential of facilitating greater communication and greater capacities to really collaborate within a sphere of mutual. It's more like we do similar things. So it's connecting the leaders who do similar things that can then take those connections that they all have, sort of, I want to be able to articulate this correctly. And perhaps I'm not consciously recalling what the nodes actually represent enough to feel confident in articulating that. Suffice it to say, these nodes are connections between leaders within the community that can, in coming together and in collaboration, facilitate through their networks the distribution of resources more, I don't know that I'd say equally, but more in a way that is founded in principles of love. But I think what keeps sort of coming to me as an example is how the gravitation and the focus largely in that work is on leaders in the community who have already built up sort of a distribution network, if you will, a distribution of resources, a distribution of information, just a different distribution of connection. I can appreciate that vision and I can appreciate that work. I do, in a way, feel like there's fundamental differences in an approach to community networking. And here, it doesn't necessarily feel like the focus and attention, it doesn't feel like the focus and attention wants to go toward identifying the leadership as leadership tends to be perceived. It doesn't gravitate toward focusing on that perceived leadership and bringing that leadership together, per se. That's not to say that that wouldn't appear to arise. That doesn't mean that that aspect in the process is not valuable and worthy. It's just that doesn't feel like the primary focus. That doesn't feel like that's what wants to be facilitated currently. There's still something that kind of feels overlooked. And I don't use that word with the intention of being critical in a sort of with any malice to it. It's not criticism in that sense. It's not disparagement. It's not devaluing it in any sense. It's more that the overlookedness is something desiring to express, is something desiring to be lived that perhaps isn't quite there, if you will, that just hasn't physically come into formation, if you will. There's something that feels more almost as though the nodes are each person as a leader within themselves, each person as an authority within themselves, embodying that, learning about it within themselves, feeling it within themselves, and it not being dependent on what is perceived as the leadership currently. And that's, again, that does not mean that the leadership as it is currently perceived is wrong and bad. It doesn't mean that at all. It just shifts the focus and sort of decentralizes the focus a bit. It decentralizes leadership. It decentralizes authority. And like a lot of other groups' intentionality, it sort of empowers each individual to sense and feel and embody the authority and the leadership within themselves. It's a leadership and authority that transcends the egoic sense of self. And so it goes beyond the perception of what it is to be a leader today, because the perception of what it is to be a leader and the perception of who is a leader in the community today, who is a leader within the community today, is still largely rooted and founded in the perception, in that sort of egoic centric perspective. And that's not to say it's wrong and bad. That's just to say that perception is still a lot of what breathes life into how we lead and how we listen. And maybe it makes sense here to say, what is an egoic perception of leadership? What does that even mean? Shit, I have to get ready soon. I don't want to rush because the invitation is coming. There's an invitation to explore a little bit more what is even meant by egoic perception of leadership. Leadership sort of rooted in an egoic centric perspective of self, sense of self. Because I guess in the question of, well, what does it mean to even transcend that? How does the ego perceive leadership? How does the egoic sense of self perceive leadership? The ego being that sort of identification. Yeah, I really need to start getting ready. So I think I'm going to have to end it there for now. It's not quite where I want to end it because I feel like I'm leaving it off on a huge sort of cliff note. Not cliff note, cliffhanger. And honestly, this is actually helpful to me because to some degree, I think it helps me even process for the egoic sense of self here. It helps to process leadership here, because leadership is something that has felt disconnect. There has been felt a disconnect here with the sort of concept and embodiment of what it is to lead, what it is to experience leadership. And so I think it might be kind of interesting to dive into that and explore that a bit more. For now, I'm just going to leave it there and perhaps circle back to it. Well, circle back to it at another moment in time. Similarly to this past Thanksgiving, this Christmas was very different. And it was a first because it was sort of a Christmas in which, for me personally, the past 36 years of Christmas tradition was transformed. And it was sort of superseded by what is taking shape as perhaps a new tradition, in that for all of the years that I can consciously remember, there was a certain routine and there was a certain process in how the holidays were celebrated. And this year, because of my parents moving to upstate New York permanently, because of me living in upstate New York as opposed to across the country where I would come back east for the holiday season and just sort of be planted in New Jersey for that time period, this sort of setting, this holiday season witnessed a very different setting and a very different sort of environment for the family, if you will, to negotiate, to navigate. And so the sort of transition from a very sort of set in stone tradition to what is now kind of ambiguous and really hasn't taken shape. This is sort of the first iteration of it. It's just being given new life. There's this really interesting transition point and curiosity and potentiality to explore how those relationships sort of are reformed. And so the structure that has largely been in place, that has kind of been the foundation that has felt very foundational, that has largely kind of been uprooted. It's largely been dislocated, if you will. So it's very interesting, and I can already tell in communication with family with family members that moving forward, this is going to be an open book, sort of an open page for continuous unfolding exploration into what's possible beyond the sort of rigidified structures. And that's not to say that the structures, the tradition, if you will, that has been in place is wrong, and that's not to say that it's bad. In a way, there was a bit of a grieving process there, and to some extent there still is an experience of that emotion. And yet there's also simultaneously this wonder and curiosity and gratitude and excitement about what is possible. It's really interesting to witness and experience and be present in a change in structure, a change in tradition, how new structures can take shape.